every day 70 millionaires were produced in India. They were created due to the economic policies that we have. So a person who is working in rural areas, who is contributing majority of his resources and time to create an economic impetus, a surplus for the nation, he has to slog for 941 years. But capitalism really maintains that their future has to be decided not by a public consensus, not by a democratic practice, but capitalism really has to think about themselves through having a monopoly. Capitalism cannot be a solution to emancipate poor people. To liberate poor people, there has to be something beyond capitalism. Capitalism, by its very essence and definition, is not liberatory. Periyar wanted land reform. Periyar wanted abolition of gender divide. He also wanted to have minimum wage for workers. He also wanted to have welfare of workers. He also wanted to maintain a certain dignity of working classes. Politics was rooted in the idea of social and economic justice. State socialism, Dr. Ambedkar, was meant for the United States of India. He realized India as the United States when federalism was going to be uniting factor, or rather dividing, as we see today.
Good morning all. Welcome to the 5th session of the TNtalk series. We are delighted to have our esteemed chief guest, Dr. Suraj Yengde, an eminent international human rights attorney and a scholar from Harvard and Oxford University. He is one of India's leading scholars and public intellectuals who authored the bestseller Caste Matters and co-edited the award-winning anthology, The Radical in Ambedkar. He is a respected columnist in the Indian Express, The Hindu, The Huffington Post, and other renowned publications. He has published over 150 essays, articles, book reviews in multiple languages. His work spans in various fields such as caste, race, human rights, social justice, and ethnicity studies. He has delivered over 300 lectures and keynote addresses at international conferences and seminars on various social issues. Currently, he is involved in developing a critical theory of Dalit and Black Studies. Dr. Suraj holds a research associate position in the Department of African and African American Studies. He is a transnational Dalit rights activist who has worked with leading international organizations. His exceptional contributions have been acknowledged through various prestigious awards, including the Bhai Vaidya Young Leader National Award, Jai Bhim Icon Award, and Dr. Ambedkar Social Justice Award. Thank you for accepting our invitation, sir. We eagerly anticipate an insightful and inspiring session on state socialism.
I am so happy to be invited to deliver this edition of TNtalks. I want to first of all extend my gratitude to the department for extending the kind invitation. Also the consultant, young brother Vijay, for facilitating this. And also my friends and comrades sitting here from Tamil Nadu. Many more I hope will join. I'm also very excited to be speaking with this mic. I've never spoken with this thing on my left ear, so that's also a first time even that I'll have. In addition to the thank you, I want to acknowledge the presence of my mom and my family who has come all the way from Nanded, and also my dear brother Dr. Bharati Prabhu for his presence. So today's topic is envisaging inclusive state socialism. Now when we think about this extremely complex topic, we have to really tease out what it really means to think about socialism, to think about inclusivity, but also to determine the future of our nation, the future of our society. Now let me start by some figures. 1% of Indians own 40% of India's national wealth. 10% of Indians own 77% of India's national wealth. Now, if we add to that, approximately 670 million Indians, 670 million Indians only saw the rise in their income to 1% in last 3 years. Now, these are the numbers that are not only startling and exhausting and anxious, but these are also the reality that we see today in India. Now, in addition to these numbers, the majority of India's population, which is a bottom half, have not seen a rise in their income beyond 3%. Since 2018, every day India produced 70 millionaires. I repeat, every day 70 millionaires were produced in India. They were created due to the economic policies that we have. Now, the income disparity is so much that if a regular rural person who is living in one of the villages, and if he gets some minimum wage, if he gets his minimum wage, he has to work for 941 years to match just an annual income of a top executive in Indian private companies. So a person who is working in rural areas, who is contributing majority of his resources and time to create an economic impetus, a surplus for the nation, he has to slog for 941 years. Now that figure becomes much more startling. About 119 individuals in India own 24,500 billion rupees. What that means is, that's the annual budget of an entire country. The Indian fiscal budget of 1 year is equivalent to the wealth 119 individuals own. Now this figure becomes much more troubling when we see that at one side 70 millionaires are created every day, but on the other side every 2 seconds another Indian is put to poverty. His income or her income is again going to the trenches of below poverty line. With that, what we effectively see is that the taxation that are given exempt to the billionaires, the exemptions that are given to billionaires contribute to 1 lakh crore per year. Now, 1 lakh crore per year is what the India's 119 individual plus the people who are trying to rise to a level are struggling to meet their ends. That's why the government has offered them a tax exemption, and that tax exemption end of the year is 1 lakh crore. And if government decides to tax Gautam Adani, then the revenue that the government will gain from taxing Gautam Adani's assets, with that wealth we can fund an entire union budget for 1 year. That is the state of capitalist inequality that we see today in India. What that really represents to us is a figure of a system that values competition but based on exploitation. Capitalism thrives on two basic phenomena. The first is ownership of private individuals. What that necessarily means is, if you own the resources that the nature has given to humans, to the plants, to the animals, but due to the obsessive desire and post-late industrial capitalism that has come, the formula has been that individuals should own as much as they can. They should control as much as they can. What should they own and what should they control? Something that they have not produced, something that they have gone out to exploit it and then own and then possess for it. Nature that is available to everybody equally, no matter humans, no matter non-humans, the flora and fauna. Yet, the human beings have created a formula for themselves wherein they are out there to reclaim that they have not produced. And the absolute desire to own permanently something, generationally something, has been one of the primary tenets of capitalism. So capitalism basically means I am an individual, and today we can see people who identify themselves as feudal lords, people who identify themselves as new rich people. People are owning mountains. People are owning jungles. These natural resources are written under the name of one individual or their corporate or their company or their family trust. People not only own mountains and jungles, they also own natural beaches. And today we know that phenomena. The most prettiest beach is taken over by hotels as well as the industries that are operating in service providing, who are charging people to the rates of that they cannot never afford, but they have owned the pristine access to the beach where people cannot really have access to the wondrous nature that has offered us through the sea as well as other important locations. What we necessarily see is capitalism really thrives on concentrating wealth into the hands of few people. The second tenet of capitalism works is you have to go and you need a society where market controls the laws, where market controls the future, where the market controls the existing of individuals. And by that, they want to replace state with market. And then market goes out to decide a policy where more exploitation is generated through creating of more surplus. Now the surplus idea is what Karl Marx wrote in his famous thesis to thinking about when a person who creates a certain value by providing his or her labor, but the labor that they put into is not commensurate to the surplus they are producing, and the surplus, the extra, the excess they produce becomes the emasculation of majority of the profits that the capitalist enterprise need. And for capitalism to thrive, they need access to resources, which is mostly natural. Second, they need access to human labor, which is available. Third, they need access to a certain state wherein they can then go together and create much more profits. But capitalism really maintains that their future has to be decided not by a public consensus, not by a democratic practice, but capitalism really has to think about themselves through having a monopoly, where an individual will have a monopolistic right over certain things, and then you will not have access to any other things. One of the intentional aspects of doing was to create a notion of intellectual property. The whole idea of intellectual property was to dominate, was to not have any more further access to the resources, to other people who want to create or who want to be much more innovative. And through that capitalistic regime, inequality is reproduced, where rich is giving birth to the next rich person and the next rich person, whereas poor is giving poor to the next poorer person. And the third generation, fourth generation, they end up going below the level of poverty, most often dying without having to nutritious food, access to good health care, no access to good education, and because of that, their life just becomes life of penury, full of sins. And to this, the divinity is added as a justification, where karmic values, where life that you have taken previous birth is a punishment for what you are suffering in this contemporary life. Spiritualism then is added to justify the exploitation of human beings, exploitation of flora, exploitation of fauna, and the nature that is out there. Now with capitalism, what we necessarily see is the poor person really has to only dream of his riches. And that's why the temples and religious institutions like church and mosque are rich anywhere in the world where you see inequality and capitalism thriving, because people, if they have to spend 941 years to make what an executive makes in 1 year, for them the only rescue option is to look for spiritual solace. And that's why They work hard. Mahatma Phule, in his famous treatise, Whipcord of Cultivator, in his famous treatise, wrote that a poor Shudra, a farmer who's cultivating his bare 1 acre or few acres of land that he has, but at the end of the day, he cannot make his ends meet, and for that, what does he do? He thinks that I need to go and worship to a Brahmin. By worshipping a Brahmin, he will give me access, a passport to the God, and the God then will offer me a spiritual solace. Maybe, hopefully, my harvest comes out with much more yields. These are the dimensions that are then clubbed through making what a capitalist enterprise looks like. But our leaders thought of an alternative system. They thought capitalism cannot be a solution to emancipate poor people. If you want to liberate poor people, there has to be something beyond capitalism. Capitalism, by its very essence and definition, is not liberatory. It's by its very essence is meant to be exploitative. It's by its essence is meant to cultivate more and more inequality. And our agenda is to seek equality, to seek social justice, to seek economic liberation. And for that, the two prominent leaders that come out of this land are very powerful. One is Dr. Ambedkar, and second, E.V.R. Periyar. Periyar and Ambedkar are somebody who are very much convinced that socialism is the right alternative, is a proper methodological formula to come out the economic duress. Periyar in 1931 goes to Soviet Russia, and when he goes to Soviet Russia, he's there for 1 year. He's not just going to Soviet Russia, he's going through the boat route, through Ceylon, and then he's visiting Egypt, then he's visiting West Europe, and he's going to East Europe, and then he's certainly spending time with the atheists of Russia, but also congregating with the communists of the world. There he is noticing how inequality is reproduced. And then when he's thinking that this model is something that can be applicable where post-Bolshevik revolution that happened in Russia, people are trying and acquiring equality, something that my country desperately needs. So when Periyar returns to this land, he's thinking, how can I bring such prosperity to my country? But then he is faced with a very rigid, very, very big wall, the wall of casteism, the wall of Brahminism. And for that, he's thinking, if communism has to be spread out in India, we have to tackle the monster of Brahminism. In fact, he writes an excellent article. Karthik Manoharan, it really deciphers into it. Venkatachalapati wrote about what Soviet trip meant for Periyar. But when they came here, he thought, for us to establish ideal socialism, socialism of equality, socialism in aspects of cultural, political life, we really need to tackle the primary nexus, which is the monster of caste and Brahminism. And for that, he said, Indian Brahmins are antithetical to anything to do with socialism. Their justification of existence has been meant to exploit the poor people. And exploitation of poor people, illiterate people, with that meant to keep them generationally oppressed and downtrodden, is the tenet of Brahminical Hindu practices. That's what Periyar identified, and for him, the ideal solution to establish anything to do with economic equality is to go via social reform, via social liberation of people. And that's why Periyar zeroes in on how we can liberate poor people. And for their liberation of poor people, we have to give them a powerful social indice that can help them, that can encourage them and lay a foundation of social change. Periyar wanted land reforms. Periyar wanted abolition of gender divide. He also wanted to have minimum wage for workers. He also wanted to have welfare of workers. He also wanted to maintain a certain dignity of working classes. Politics was rooted in the idea of social and economic justice. And for that to happen, his formula was same. But Dr. Ambedkar, the maverick who came out of again this land, wrote India's constitution, but his primary submission to the Indian Republic was what he identified as improvised form of state socialism. Ambedkar's republic was state socialism de facto. In fact, in 1947, 15th March, he submitted a manifesto on behalf of All India Scheduled Caste Federation. This was meant to be an ideal constitution. He wrote, and it was meant to be submitted to the Constituent Assembly. But then Dr. Ambedkar was not part of Constituent Assembly. During this time, during this era, Dr. Ambedkar noticed that this country needs to come out of its menacing duress. And for it to come out of it, they need a solid constitutional formula, a provision of state socialism. State socialism, Dr. Ambedkar, was meant for United States of India. He realized India as the United States when federalism was going to be uniting factor, or rather dividing, as we see today. Through that lens, Dr. Ambedkar identifies, way back in 1927 when he was member of Bombay Council, Dr. Ambedkar wrote and argued in Bombay Council that land tax and income tax are two different things. And he is thinking about the poor farmer in the field. Now the poor farmer, as opposed to a landlord owning thousands of acres, both own land and they are taxed on their land. Now imagine a person who's owning 1 or 2 acres, who is barely making his ends meet. He has a family of 5 people. He has to take care of them and also create some profit for himself so that he can contribute and continue his profession for next year. But if there is a drought, but if there is a flood, if there is natural calamity that he cannot provide to, he is still taxed the same as what a 1,000-acre landlord is being charged. Now the taxation Dr. Ambedkar found was something very unjustful. This was not something that would be very, very in support of people who are owning small portions of land. That's why in his economic thesis, Small Holdings, he was thinking about how small holdings could be a potential disaster, but also if proper policies are made and taxes are given adequately, they could then work out efficiently. So when thinking about land revenue and the land taxation, Dr. Ambedkar is profoundly invested in how income tax can be merged irrespective of the land ownership of people. Meaning, if a person who's owning 1,000 acres, his income is coming out to, let's say, 1,000 rupees, as opposed to somebody who's making 1 acre and his income is coming out to 10 rupees. Now, if you charge income tax of how much they make, the income tax is on the 1,000 rupees as opposed to the land revenue that they are creating. So Ambedkar wanted to create a harmonious socialistic principle. In 1937, again, Dr. Ambedkar was somebody who wanted state to be the primary owner of resources. Like capitalist enterprise wants market to run the society, market to run the parliament, market to run the media, market to run the bureaucracy. They want market, which is a free market enterprise, and they celebrate it. They argue state is an inefficient component of our human civilization. And for that purpose, they proposed the idea of state, free market state. And so the free market state operates without any control of public accountability. Now here Dr. Ambedkar was proposing much more radical, much more fundamental in 1937. He stated, when the Congress party proposed an economic program, Dr. Ambedkar argued against it and he said, the government has to be primary owner of people's welfare. He was advocating for social welfarist policies. 1937. 1936, when he was started, Independent Labour Party, his politics was very much rooted in labor and poor people's liberation. Dr. Ambedkar then proposes a radical formula: access to quality education, access to health care, access to insurance, access to retirement pension benefits, access to old age benefits, access to their own leisure lifestyle, and having a balanced approach to individuals' welfare and individuals' future has to be primarily state ownership. Dr. Ambedkar also wanted a certain minimum wage threshold for people then to draw the benefits out of it. Now that was 1937. He continued with that formula 1947, again 20 years later, 1927 to 1947. He's proposing the same. And in his economic model, Dr. Ambedkar really focuses on 4 things. First, on land. He says the land that is out there, the government should be owner of that land, and farmers should be appointed as tenants. So if farmers are appointed as tenants, they will be provided necessary seeds and necessary requirements for them to cultivate. And once they will make more yields, they can share the profit and the rest they can give to the government. And let's say if there is a drought or flood, what will a poor farmer do? Don't worry, the state is responsible for you. You will have access to state resources. If you cannot make profits, if you cannot yield properly, the state will then put in their resources or help you for the time being. Second, he was thinking about national insurance. Depending on their income, they should have access to basic national insurance. Today, that remains one of the most fundamental challenges where people die because they cannot have access to quality healthcare. Dr. Ambedkar wanted to make that part of fundamental economic policy for individuals' welfare. The third important policy Dr. Ambedkar wanted was about industries. He said the key industries of the state should be owned by the government. The government should run this. The key industries that are out there, you have to identify which are the most revenue generating and key aspect for sustenance of social economic life of people. They need to be owned by the state. And there are other basic industries. We should identify them, and the state should either run it or appoint a corporation to run this. Today we have so many public service undertakings, we have many corporations. That is the formula that Dr. Ambedkar had envisioned when he was thinking about socialism. And finally, Dr. Ambedkar was really invested in making sure that when farming is done, when land is being redistributed, the idea has to be that the government takes access of land from the people. Because if you are a family of 5 people, you will be given a land that is necessary for your survival, and you will have a decent, good life. Your lifestyle will not be compromised, but there is no point for you to sit on 500 acres of land when you and your family will need basically 10 to 15 acres of land. Take the rest of the land, but we will not take away violently. We will compensate you in the form of debentures. Dr. Ambedkar wanted to pay compensation to the landlords or the people who were owning their ancestral land. The government takes over, and a formula of collective farming was proposed, where people, irrespective of their caste, irrespective of their creed, irrespective of the kula, will come together and do a collective farming in village, in their own area. So then they can work collectively and really give an example of how a powerful village republic should look like, how a powerful landed gentry should look like. It should not be decided according to the casteism, according to the Brahminic values that the Manu Dharma has proposed. It has to be within the modern technology, and for that Dr. Ambedkar wanted modernity, modern equipments and modern technology to be deployed in order to create more and more revenue. That's why when he was a minister developing Bhakranangal Dam, he enlisted the creator of one of the largest dam in America, sought his counsel to really propose a new modernization of this value. Now, modernization was something that Nehru was also invested, but Dr. Ambedkar was also invested. Dr. Ambedkar, one of the things that he was disagreeing with Nehru was he really kept him to the fringes, did not give the important portfolio planning, where Dr. Ambedkar wanted to leave the foundation of India's republic modernized. So today when we will think about any developed countries, if you talk about China, if you talk about Japan, they thrived on the important nexus of modernity. And that's how, be it Periyar, be it Dr. Ambedkar, or be it various other revolutionaries who thought through it. But Dr. Ambedkar was very insistent on one thing. We can talk about social, we can talk about political, we can talk about cultural, but what about economic virtues of society? The economic virtues need to be balanced. There has to be something more strong force that will support the economic foundations of society. And what is that? He looked through the historical evidences and he found the strong moral force of Dhamma. He looked at the Buddha offering the powerful solace and support and foundation to the economic society, to the social society, to the political society, to the cultural society, that a new society has to be formed without a strong moral force. Because in capitalist society, people are still attuned, they are attributing, they are still blindfolded, they are still committed to the divinity. They are still committed to the spiritual power. It has to be replaced with something which is much more moral, which is much more ethical, which is much more rational, which is much more scientific, which is much more grounded, which is much more native, which is much more truer, which is much more maitri, fraternity, friendship. And for that, he found an absolute panacea in the Buddha's Dhamma. The Dhamma sits on 2 values. One is 5-fold path, Panchashila. And the second is Ashtangika Marga, 8-fold path. These 2 are the foundation stones of any socialist democracy. And for that, Dr. Ambedkar brought in the parlance of Buddha as opposed to Marx. In the Marxist maxim, he saw violence. In the Marxist maxim, he saw untenability of such force. But in Buddha, he saw non-violence. In Buddha, he saw tenability and sustainability of the system that he's trying to establish. Because the question that Dr. Ambedkar asked to everybody of us was, what if the communistic society that wants to establish socialism is totally committed to bringing equality, but that equality is coming from dictatorship, and two, it is coming from force. These are the two tenets that maintain and sustain any socialistic communist society. But what happens when you remove the force? And what happens when you remove the dictatorship? Because these are the two things that people in general don't like. People will not appreciate dictatorship forever. They might appreciate you for 10, 15, 20 years, but eventually they will get tired. Because people by their own virtue like liberty. They like to have variety. They like to express their grievance. They like to reject some notions that they are not proud of. So dictatorship doesn't allow you that. Second is force. You cannot keep a person in force forever. All the forces that have been brought by coercion have lost their grip on society. Only history books can tell us that the people who were tyrants, who were deploying force, were people who are not even remembered in history. If at all they come into the citation of history, they are negated, they are berated, they are insulted, because they could not sustain themselves without adding the force. But you can replace these two dimensions, dictatorship and force, with two different. One is the idea of democracy, which upholds liberty, person freedom, which upholds the idea of recognizing other person's democracy. Democracy doesn't necessarily mean just to govern as a form of system, but democracy also, Dr. Ambedkar, means, drawing from his teacher John Dewey, associated living, where you have to live together, which means recognizing the democracy in other person too. And the second, for the force, he said, instead of force as a violent energy, we can make it as a peaceful dhammic energy and make it a moral, ethical force. And for that foundation, Dr. Ambedkar was part of the great lineage that the Tamil culture brought up, of course, through Pandit Ayuthithasar, who really gave foundations. Of course, the lineage came from the Sri Lankan heritage. The idea of Dravida was itself the idea of Naga. Naga, Dravida meant Buddhist. So the very notion, very recognition, very identity of Dravida is standing on the fundamentals of Buddha. The Dhammic identity of Dravida became the identity of Dhamma. So today, whoever identifies and calls themselves, Dr. Ambedkar wrote in his famous thesis, are Nagas and Dravidas different? No, they are not different, they are same. There is an idea of cultural category, linguistic category. Dravida remains a linguistic category. Dravidian language, Tamil, was practiced by North Indian Nagas as well, North Indian Dravidas as well. But due to the influence of Sanskrit, they gave up on Tamil, Dr. Ambedkar argues, but their lineage remained same. They remained the part and parcel of the same cultural, religious, and social family. And that's why the legacy of Buddhist virtue remains as much legacy of Tamil Nadu, it remains the legacy of entire India, envisioned through the great Emperor Samrat Ashok. And he was somebody who was laying the foundation that Dr. Ambedkar was proposing, the foundations of Dhamma social republic. That's the kind of India that we were trying to propose, and that's the India that we want. We don't want people who are born in poverty to think for 1,000 years that they cannot be liberated. We need a system, we need a society where people think, my child is born and I'm guaranteed that the person will not have the same poverty, will not have the same experience of suffering, but will live a dignified life. If I was born, and I was born in the family where my father was working as a peon, but he could dream that we cannot live my second generation also doing peon. He cannot become the class 4 category child. He has to be much bigger. He has to be much more visionary. For that, there was a moral force, but also there was a state that was supporting. And that state today is somehow being sold to the hands of those 100 people that are billionaires, that are controlling the national economy. And if those 100 people are controlling national economy, I can tell you, there will be hardly a chance for another Suraj Yengde to be born. We have to rescue ourselves from such kind of dominating force. We have to think of our next generation. Today, if a child is born and if you want to give the child the health care, government hospital are the worst spots for them to go. But that is the only venue to go. How many people have lost their lives because they couldn't have access to quality education, quality hospital. They cannot just think of it. Just go to any government hospital that you have access to and just see outside how many people from rural areas, from poor areas are just waiting for their turn so that doctor can at least touch them and give them some medicine. Many a times they do not have recognition because they come from poor, come from backward regions, and most of them are belonging to the SC, ST, OBC community. The original producers, the original Nagas, the Dravidas of this land are still subordinated in this new economic and social system where our four visionaries were thinking about liberating us from this kind of shackles of casteism and class oppression. And today we again go down through this hole, even though there are formulas, there are solutions offered by them. Today, when we go to education, private coaching institutes have taken and replaced the education responsibility. Children from Maharashtra, where I come from, are from 3rd grade going to private tuition instead of going to schools and colleges. This is the tragic situation. And you better know, a person cannot make his children, if he has 2 children, in today's economy, send to a good quality education. Swachh Bharat mission, under that aegis in Nanded, there is one person who comes every week to pick up the dirt that the colony gathers together. I asked him before coming to the talk, how much do you make? He said, sir, I don't have a fixed salary. I said, what do you mean? He said, it depends on how much weight I carry. And then the contractor is going to weigh, and accordingly I make. I said, then approximately how much you make? Sir, it depends. 12,000 is average what I make. And I said, what about your children? He said, sir, I have 2 children. I said, what about them? Sir, it's very difficult. My daughter is hoping to become a officer in government service, and my son is far away from him, and I hope he also becomes an engineer. Now he has 12,000. He has 2 children. Now can you tell me, the child that is hoping to become an officer with the salary of 12,000, and the child who is now going into government, who's going to engineering school, can afford with that 12,000 salary? But the success stories are going to come out, but that's the failure of a state. And then I asked him, what about your permanent job? Who is your contractor? The worker was belonging to the Dalit community. The contractor was belonging to a Baniya community, which means even in this neoliberal economy, the poverty is outsourced, where direct accountability of the state is absent. The state doesn't want to take responsibility of its own citizens. It wants to make sure that the citizens are kept frustrated. It wants to make sure the citizens are kept in limbo, and it wants to make sure that they always slog. Every time you want to see your mother or father, they're always working somewhere because they want to make sure they can keep in your plate a desirous, nutritious food that they can give you. But because of cultural nationalism, they can't even afford to that. If you eat a certain type of meat, you are criminalized and penalized, whereas you are trying to invoke your supremacy, your caste privilege, by identifying as pure vegetarian as opposed to impure non-vegetarian. This kind of cultural ethos regulates our society, and today neoliberalization has done much more worst offense on poor people and the outcast people, on the lower caste people and the oppressed caste people, much more than what we see the post-independent politics was done. If a child from Jharkhand, if a man from Jharkhand has to leave his village and seek a job far away land where it takes 2 days railway journey for him to reach, he doesn't know what's happening in his home. And if he has to go urgent meet, he cannot meet. And what is the kind of salary he's making? He's making a salary equivalent of a beggar. This economy has created an employed lot of beggars who can barely make their ends meet. And if this is the solution that the capitalist, that the casteist, that the neoliberal society can offer, we can already see the state, the country, the future of this nation is going to go to doom. We cannot afford for the poor people to just keep dreaming. We have to offer them an actual inclusive solace, and that means a radical formula, radical restructuring and redistribution of land. In Tamil Nadu, there is a lakhs of acres of land, Panchama land belonging to the scheduled caste communities. Yet the possession of their land remains a distant dream. It's not just the case of Tamil Nadu, it remains the case of Maharashtra, it remains the case of Punjab, it remains the case of Rajasthan, it remains the case of Andhra Pradesh. Despite having progressive measures, and a tiny minority, minuscule middle class cannot be a liberator of an entire community. The liberation has to come from the poor, working class, grassroots people, rural people, They need to be the one who are deciding the future course of action. And this was the formula that was given by Periyar the Great, Dr. Ambedkar the Great, and our Constitution. And these are the values that unless and until we stick by, our cultural nationalism is going to turn into spiritual nationalism, which is in turn to turn into a poverty nationalism. And today, poor people's nationalism is becoming the richest people's fanfare. We don't have access to leisure, we don't have access to producing definitive forms of environment that our children can confidently attest to. We are afraid now to bring younger children, to give birth to new people, to new children, because we are not sure if we can afford them the quality education we can give. We are not sure if they are getting sick, we can give them access to the health care, to the good hospital that we can. We are not sure if we turn old, we'll have enough money. We are not sure if their children are having to go to any extraordinary activities. We cannot afford to send them to sports or send them to cultural events. We just cannot afford. And due to this, there has been a lot bigger plot than what our eyes can make. We can see that around us. So it remains a proposition that idea of socialism is one of the answers. But George Bernard Shaw in 1926 wrote a thesis. That is when he has received the Nobel Prize in Literature for, of course, his wit and, of course, his contribution to literary genius that he was. George Bernard Shaw said, socialism only comes at a later stage. Socialism doesn't come at the foundational start of a civilization. Capitalism immediately acquires that. The socialistic principles are slow in recognizing that. And for us to heed to the warning of George Bernard Shaw, we really need to think what it will take for socialist values to become the pioneer, the word he used, to become the fragmentary sources that are available there and make it a cogent force, a moral force, the force that our ancestors have proposed and the force that we need to carry forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Suraj. Your thoughts on capitalism and private monopolistic ownership of resources, and how capitalism cannot be a solution for liberation, and Ambedkar's de facto being state socialism, where federalism plays as an uniting factor. All those things were substantially true. The floor is open for questions now. We can take like 6-7 questions, but we'll limit to one question per person now.
So, do you think statelessness is a proper alternative to state socialism? Do you think it is possible in the late future, provided all cultural changes have happened?
So, do you think the political parties are being controlled by these big billionaires? Because there is no inclusivity in the parliament and the state legislature. The reserved seats are only being filled.